The authoritarian left never rests, from Peter Hitchens. I wonder if the authoritarian left is going to be the actual authoritarian left, meaning, well, I guess whatever is left over of the supporters of Mao and Stalin, and not people on college campuses who yell at bigots.
At some point, I mean, I'm an ex-Bolshevik, and this
Hilarious start.
One, it means that I have
an ex-Bolshevik. I want to know what this means.
A lot to be guilty about. Secondly, it gives me insights into the politics and nature of the modern left, which most people don't have.
I doubt that.
One of the things that I did when I was still a revolutionary socialist was try and prevent people from exercising freedom of speech and thought. It came naturally.
Could you talk a little bit louder?
It came naturally to me because I believed that what I thought and desired was so good that anybody who disagreed with me must, by their nature, be evil and be deserving of being silenced. And this is the problem. The general left-wing belief, which is held by the elites of most Western countries now, is also a belief in their own virtue. And if you believe very strongly in your own virtue, and your virtue is based, it's almost a caricature of justification by faith alone, you are a good person because you hold a certain opinion.
Conservatives don't believe in their own virtue by faith alone. Isn't that like the entire idea of an individualist conservative morality? That you're virtuous by virtue of your a particular faith in a set of values and traditions, and often there's a religious element to it, and that everybody else is sinful depending on how religious you want to get with it.
Therefore, if you hold other opinions, you're a bad person. And I think that makes dialogue pretty much impossible. If you think your opponent is bad.
I'm not saying people on the left don't act like that, but to be clear, this has nothing to do with left-wing ideology. I mean, left-wing ideology is, correct. So if anything, people on the left would have a better claim to this than people on the right. Oh God, is this an example of me doing this right now when I say I'm correct? No, everybody believes that they're correct. This is not an interesting insight. Everybody believes that they're correct and everybody else who doesn't agree with them is wrong and immoral, therefore, right? It depends on the type of person that you have, on individual differences that determine how a person acts based on that belief that they're correct, if they are intolerant of others or not. This has nothing to do with left-wing versus right-wing, although I would argue that because right-wing ideology is more irrational, maybe there's a greater tendency towards it. But I don't want to indulge too much in that right now when I'm telling him that to cut out trying to just accuse people on the left of it. Obviously, we can't ignore our own biases.
Not just wrong, but bad. Why should you listen to a word he says? Well, they don't.
Well, why is it then that we can't learn the lessons of history? It's not as if it's so very... You lived in Soviet Russia for a long time. You saw the outcomes of that sort of elitist view.
The left have learned the lessons of history to this extent. They understand that the Bolshevik attempt failed, that the Soviet experiment was a disaster.
Okay.
That hasn't cured them of wanting to create paradise on earth. They've just thought, how should we do it another way? Which is how we come to Antonio Gramsci, one of the first and most intelligent communists to understand that the Soviet experiment had failed as long ago as the 1920s. He realized that the civilized working classes of Western Europe were never going to swallow this sort of thing, that there had to be a huge cultural revolution before they ever would. And his ideas took root, particularly in the big Southern European communist parties, his own in Italy.
Are we doing the cultural Marxism thing, or are we doing actual
and began
analysis
to spread out beyond the communist parties themselves into the left in general, the ideas of cultural, moral and social revolution, not by violent overthrow, not through dictatorship of the proletariat, not even through seizure
Okay, because for a second there I thought we were getting an actual, there were anarchists and other communists who realized that the Soviet Union was not going to achieve, in his words, paradise on earth, and that an anti-authoritarian approach is actually what was needed. But I realized we're actually just doing the cultural Marxism. We have to destroy, Western civilization in order to rebuild it, whatever, destroy the... all the things, family, gender, etc. I'm not to put words in his mouth, but all right.
Or sequestration of industries and banks, but through the capture by the long march to the institutions of the television studio and the university and the newspaper office and the publishing house and the school, so that after 30 or 40 years of that, you would control pretty much the public mind, and you would be able to get pretty much what you wanted. And it's clever, and you have to concede to the
Liberal progressivism being dominant in media, and I would disagree about education, but obviously to some extent in higher education he's correct, and being the prevailing attitude of the popular mind, at least in a majoritarian sense, has nothing to do with Marxism or socialist revolutionaries. It's simply that these ideas, progressive ideas, are more broadly applicable because they include more people. They have greater appeal. They make it easier for us to get along as a society. They make it easier for companies to sell things to more people. They're just winning out. Nothing to do with Marxists infiltrating the schools.
These people, some admiration for their endless determination, their deep belief in what they want, and their subtle and in many cases very clever organization to achieve it. It's been a very, very well exercised revolution, and they have learned from history. The one thing they haven't learned, which I wish they would learn, is that they're wrong. But they have learned how to be wrong better. And
who are we talking? Are we still talking about Marxists?
So two questions immediately arise for me. Given that the great bulk of people are surprisingly sensible when it comes to not being misled by intelligentsia.
I would completely disagree with that. I think the great bulk of people are incredibly easily misled. I find
yes, but not by the quote-unquote intelligentsia.
Over and over again, people I like, people with who might write to me one week and say, "I really liked what you wrote." The next week, we'll be sprouting some drivel about the Russian menace. Or whatever fashionable nonsense happens to have been fed to them by the media they trust. It's extraordinary how gullible people are.
I find that a very challenging thought as somebody from a country where we pride ourselves on our pragmatism and our ability to see through bull dust. We think we do. Now, you've been to Australia quite a bit.
One of the great things about thinking that you see through it is that people who think that and who pride themselves on it are often the most fantastically gullible people of all.
Damn.
Well, it's an interesting...
It takes some nerve not to run with the crowd. I mean, I'm not given...
You're so brave.
Praise. I know my faults better than most people. And thanks to an awful lot of YouTube, I also know what I look like. Vanity is difficult in my position. But one thing I will say is that I have, maybe it's an instinct I've had since childhood, probably a gift not given to me, not a thing that I can claim any credit for, but I will not run with crowds. But most people will, and they do, and they're happier that way.
Well, there's a point Jordan Peterson makes to these
okay, before we start
Canada.
Talking about Jordan Peterson, like, not wanting to run with the crowd, so to speak, like, you realize you're just running with a different crowd. I mean, maybe it's a slightly, maybe people who are anti-progressive or whatever, it's a slightly smaller crowd, but it's still a very large crowd. And like, if you were genuine about this, I don't think this is actually somebody who don't likes to be involved in a crowd. Like, he is repeating basically, the exact talking points of all the other conservative IDW types that I've watched. It's very surprising how their narrative, they really only have one thing to say. Maybe that's just me and the videos I watch, but I don't think that this applies to this person. But if you were really somebody who didn't like to run with the crowd, wouldn't that create just as many opportunities for falling into misguided thinking or bias as wanting to run with the crowd, right? If you were always trying to avoid, what you was perceived as the popular opinion, wouldn't that just make it so that, like, if the popular opinion happened to be correct, you would have a bias against it? Why can't we just talk about the arguments? Why do we have to do this, like, oh, I'm not part of the group, I won't succumb to your fucking demands for thinking things that are, generally backed by empirical science and argumentation. Okay.
He points out to people that statistically speaking, they might say that they would not have joined the Hitler Youth, but statistically speaking, they would have.
Yeah.
We would have. I would have probably. But it does still concern me.
Get into that exactly, but okay. If most people in Nazi Germany joined the Hitler Youth, statistically, a person in Nazi Germany would have joined the Hitler Youth. Now, whether or not you today would have given, your prior conditioning that obviously you wouldn't have received back in, that time, would you now join the Hitler? You can't really ask that question sensibly, but I don't know. I no reason to get hung up on this example, but it's a weird example to me.
In my own country,
you look at there were people who didn't. I mean,
very few.
Joachim Fest, I think, read this book called Not Me, mainly about his father saying, "I'm not having this," but it was extremely hard not to do. And it was, most people
speak up a little bit, please.
Just as most people wouldn't have been in the French Resistance if they'd been in France in 1942, they just wouldn't have done it.
Anyway, that was part one, as a sort of plea on behalf of people in the street. They need to be more conscious of what's happening. But the second part that I wanted to drill into there is, you're very, very bright people, at least we think we have, we taxpayers in universities. Why are there not more academics? If wisdom is the ability to understand consequences and courage is the ability to point them out, why are there not more academics pushing back against some of these ideas which have proven not just disastrous?
They can't say what the ideas they can't say exactly what the ideas are, because then they would have to confront them, and then they would have to present arguments against them.
Just in practice, but
I mean, they can name them, right? And we've seen people name them, but they can't describe any of them.
Point out in theory as well. They don't work in theory. Communism doesn't work in theory either.
Hang on a minute.
Wait, communism?
We'll move on to communism in a minute. You said
he wasn't even that far. Hey, I was just talking about, people who think that gender is a social construct.
That one of the quality you're looking for is an ability to understand consequences. You mustn't assume that academics are so selfless that the ultimate consequences of society, perhaps after they're dead, are more important to them than the immediate consequences for their careers.
If conservative academics were the majority, wouldn't you have to become a progressive in order to go against the grain, right? Because you're such a free thinker.
But if I were an academic, I think I would know, indeed, or if I were in broadcasting, I think I would know pretty quickly.
Wait, what is this guy even in then?
The general conformist view.
Is he like a journalist?
Then I couldn't expect to get tenure or to rise in my profession. And these things are ultimately possibly more important to people than the total coherence or indeed the ultimate consequences of the points of view they espouse. Anyway, anybody can fool himself into believing that his own position is going to lead to paradise.
Wait, do that why couldn't the tenure racket exist just with conservative ideas, right? That doesn't explain the difference. That wouldn't explain why they've chosen one over the other.
All the time.
So perhaps G.K. Chesterton was right.
About what in this case?
Chesterton and the others who have said similar things then perhaps were right.
Who is that? What are you talking about?
Well, that's also true, but some people are. In fact, many people, it seems to me, are repelled by the consequences of believing in God. They examine it, and the implications of living in a created universe with a purpose are frightening and often don't suit people's desire for pleasures. I point out in my book, The Rage Against God, a lengthy quotation from Somerset Maugham's autobiographical novel of Human Bondage, where Philip Carey describes with extraordinary frankness the moment at which he decides not to believe in God anymore, and the personal liberation which he associates with this is very strong. He's freed from all kinds of obligations and fears which he previously had. If it was simply a matter of choosing one or the other, and there were no other implications, I think a lot of people would choose it. And it's not surprising to me. Actually, if people weren't brought up, as they are not now, if people aren't brought up to believe in the rather complicated concepts of the Christian religion, they're much more likely to fall into the far more convenient and more easily understood religion of selfism, as I describe it, of doing pretty much what suits you.
Oh, so we're not talking about belief in God philosophically. we're talking about being inculcated into the Christian religion and adhering to traditional Christian morality. I see. With different things.
Their own body, which is what a lot of people now desire. Why wouldn't they?
You use the term selfism, and I think back to your time in Australia on Q&A, when a couple of times you put your views only to be sneered at. And it struck me at that time that there's a remarkable capacity on the part of some people now to be unbelievably censorious at the same time as they want to say, don't tell us what to do. They want to tell everybody else to do. They retain that right for themselves.
Yeah, John, I would agree with that.
But they'll get an
describe some people
instant cheer, as one of your fellow panel members did that night, when he insists that you can't tell us what to do with our bodies.
Yes. Well, I think that's, you oughtn't to seek necessarily consistency in most people's thought, and most people are terribly inconsistent anyway, and there certainly isn't an obvious consistency in this. The causes which they adopt and the things for which they demand protection from criticism all have a specific characteristic.
What do we mean? Who's demanding protection from criticism? You guys want protection from criticism as much as anyone you oppose. You complain anytime anyone criticizes you.
The particularly former Protestant Christian societies, I think. It's every cause which they espouse is one which isn't really compatible with one of those, and they then, very cunningly, it's a sort of verbal judo where they use the strength of their opponents against them. They provoke, and this has been particularly important in the issue of homosexuality, same-sex marriage, and all the rest of it. They provoke conservatives into attacking this idea, so that they can then portray those conservatives as bigots who wish to make other people miserable.
The conservatives do that exactly.
And that's one of the reasons why conservatives have lost that.
That's what the panic about free speech and cancel culture is. They're coming for us. We need a preemptive strike. It's the exact thing.
Over and over again, and why, looking back on it, I wish I hadn't taken part in it, because it was and remains a very trivial side issue. And whether 10, 20,000 homosexuals can or cannot get married really isn't particularly important, given the almost total collapse of tens of millions of heterosexual marriages encouraged by state policy, which has been the real issue.
I mean, it's
really
a rights violation, like
Western societies over the past 50 years.
All right, well,
Thank you for watching this episode.
That was similar but different to the other John Anderson issue. It was similar in that it was equally vague and touched upon the same vague topics. It wasn't quite as meandering. I feel like they were able to have a back and forth for a little bit longer than some of the others. But it was pretty bad. It was pretty bad. All right.